Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I want to kick off today's episode with a historical query. Why did America become an economic powerhouse while Mexico did not? Or for that matter, Canada. Why did Canada, which is not terribly populated and did not have oil for the kickoff party of the country, why did it become wealthier than Mexico by most metrics? Why is that? Is it culture? Americans and Canadians value hard work, but Mexicans have we'll call it a more balanced approach to life. Well, that's hogwash. I know several Mexicans here in Texas that work a lot harder than me on a daily basis roofing or doing other very strenuous manual activity. I have a difficult time playing outside with my dog in this heat. It is not a lack of work ethic. And even if we get around the anecdotes of this, you can find communities along the Mexican-American border that started out as a unitary polity and have been split down the middle by the border. But the culture shared on either side, yet north of the border, more wealth. So it's not that. Is it a religious thing? You know, the old Protestant work ethic versus those libertine Catholics always drinking to excess during Carnival. Well, if that's the case, why is France doing so hot compared to Mexico or Canada or whatever? Italy's the fifth largest economy in the world. Italy's actually pretty good. Arguably a fairly Catholic country. That doesn't seem to be a very stout correlation, does it? For that matter, why is South Korea and Japan doing terribly well? They're not Protestant. When I think of Protestant hotbeds, I don't really think of Japan, so I don't think that's it. What about natural resources? Could that be it? America just has so many rivers and cornfields and iron deposits and tungsten that it was inevitable it would become wealthier than boring cactus-studded Mexico, that comparatively bleak desert country that I don't actually know anything about the natural resources of. I think they have oil. Whatever you think the answer to that question is, consider the following as a kind of backdrop to the discussion that's going to ensue today. The only reason that the English settled in North America was because Mexico was taken. That was not something where everybody on that side of the Atlantic fired a gun and the English went, ooh boy, let's get the eastern seaboard of North America. No, the reason that they took North America, or specifically the eastern seaboard, was by the time England got in the game of going to the New World, the Spanish and Portuguese were already humming along in Mexico and the Caribbean and throughout the old conquered Aztec, Mayan, and Incan empires. England squirted Puritans at the New World at Virginia, not because they thought Virginia was terrific, but because it was the only thing left that nobody else had claimed. England would have absolutely traded Virginia for the wealthy Aztec settlements to the south that had already been peopled and had active gold mines to plunder. Not only that, the first English settlers in Jamestown fully intended to run Virginia like Mexico. That was the plan. That is to say, the blueprint was sack it for gold, enslave the locals, emulate New Spain. Spain had repeatedly enacted the following scheme. Step 1, capture the indigenous king and hold him hostage, hold him ransom for an insane amount of money. The king would promise to pay them that astronomical sum. Don't worry, I've got courtiers. The courtiers will deliver gold and silver and topaz to you. And the nobles would bring a lot of money, but they couldn't match the crazy sums demanded by the Spanish. So even though they brought a lot of money, the Spanish would turn around and say, well, you broke your word. You said you were going to bring us, 4 Olympic swimming pools worth of gold, and you only brought 3. So at that point, they would torture the poor guy, murder him, and then keep all of the gold. Keep the 80% of the ransom that he failed to deliver. And if he somehow managed to actually get the gold, all right, figure out another technicality and torture and murder him and keep the gold. Then, step 2, enslave the entire population and direct their labor towards sending stuff back to Spain. Gold, silver, corn, tungsten, I don't know, whatever. Spanish colonies in the New World were all about exploitation. Exploit the natural resources, exploit the local labor, send the proceeds back to the mother country. And that was the plan for Virginia. When the English set up in Jamestown, they tried to lure King Wahun Seneca of the Powhatan Confederacy to visit them in Jamestown. And Wahun Seneca, who was a canny guy, went, "Are you serious? You guys come to me. I'm not sure how you do it in your weird metal hat European continent, but over here, I'm the king. You're the weird, pasty white interlopers that are on the verge of starvation in a bunch of stick homes on the coast. You come to pay homage to me. I don't go to you." And that's how John Smith met Pocahontas. They weren't able to get the king to go to an ambush. They had to go to him and work it out. The plan backfired from the start. Worse, the English then failed to subdue and enslave all of the locals to do their labor for them. It hadn't really occurred to the very first wave of settlers that they'd have to do the farming. They figured that they would be the new nobles, or at least middle management for a larger plantation of indigenous labor. But they didn't manage to pull off a Pizarro or a Cortez and conquer an existing empire that they could squat on top of. What's more, they learned that even if they did subdue the locals, the indigenous population was just too small and not dense enough to replicate a New English version of the encomienda system from down south. And on top of that, not a lot of gold mines sitting around up in Virginia, just a lot of timber and some fish, but no gold. Not active gold mines, not a lot of it anyway, not nearly as much as down south. They were told there was going to be gold and slaves, but that wasn't working out. So Jamestown and the Virginia Company had to course correct. Rather than replicating the Spanish extractive economy, which was the existent model of Europeans in the New World and the original goal, wherein locals are exploited and their efforts are dribbled back across the Atlantic to the capital, the English were forced to build up their own stuff. Initially, the Virginia Company went, all right, well, if you guys can't find slaves, I guess you're the slaves. You're all indentured servants in some form or another. But that didn't really work out. For about a decade, the English tried to make the New World settlers the labor to be exploited, but it failed, and the disgruntled English that were settlers there had demands. If we stick in this frigid, godforsaken place and we send money back to England, you'd better let us build up some of our own stuff and have burgesses that run it and whatnot. And then as time went on, England went from sending over people to extract the local economy to sending over the people it didn't want. Whereas the Spanish were sending folks over to the New World to organize the labor system and pull wealth out of Spain back to England, England was kicking out religious dissidents that it didn't want, and they were coming to the New World to build something rather than extract something. And as time would go on, England would try to make its money off of the colonies by selling them things through mercantilism rather than sucking the wealth out of them like Spain. And so New England and New Spain diverged on very different paths, not just economically, but institutionally, almost entirely, because New England just couldn't do the thing that New Spain wanted to do. And so it ended up being a colony and a dumping ground for English people that wanted to build new communities. Whereas New Spain became a large-scale extractive economy designed around sending gold across the ocean and bilking the locals for everything they were worth. The goal in New Spain was not to facilitate a prosperous colony across the ocean or to deposit troublesome Spaniards to build their own new society with hospitals and banks and factories. It was to suck all the wealth out of it. Whereas New England, unable to pull off that Spanish monstrosity, or alternately, again, there are different waves of settlers. I realize it's not monolithic, but they had their own new burgeoning societies that were focused on creating new settlements in their own right with merchants and artisans and bankers and traders. Later, one of the other developments that happened in the English experience was what would become the American South, where slave owners did pull off their own version of an extractive economy by importing labor from Africa to be their slaves. And the result was much the same as that in New Spain, a handful of wealthy elites presiding over a comparatively undeveloped, stagnant economy of desperately poor people. And so now, going back to why Mexico is poorer than America, or why even internally the American South is historically poorer than the American North, we can begin to see a prism that we can look at historical events with. That of extractive institutions like slavery or the encomienda, and inclusive institutions like property rights, class mobility, innovation, effective patent systems. The former leads to stagnation, the latter leads to development. And that is the central thesis in the book Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson, who we will meet shortly on today's episode. And I'll tell you, at first, as I read this book, I thought it was a little reductive and repetitive. I get it, Daron. Extractive institutions are bad, inclusive institutions are good. Do we really need a whole book litanizing this fairly simple dichotomy? But when I started to really grok the concept that we're going to talk about today, that dichotomy proposed by Acemoglu, I couldn't unsee it. The Roman Empire, when you look at it through that lens, was a massive extractive economy, extractive institutions, which precipitated its own stagnation and elite infighting and collapse. Conversely, the Glorious Revolution, once again in England, blew apart centuries of state-controlled monopolies and restrictive trade guilds, iron and soil kind of stuff, opening the door for inclusive institutions, which led to the Industrial Revolution and explosive growth. Daron Acemoglu is positing a kind of universal thesis for determining the trajectory of economic growth, extractive and inclusive institutions. And while the book is fascinating in its own right, it is kind of a follow-up episode to one we did earlier this summer, or it was at least precipitated by an earlier episode. Back in May, I had Rainier Zeitelman on discussing how nations escape poverty. And Zeitelman's thesis is likewise a fairly simple dichotomy. Freedom leads to prosperity, tyranny leads to poverty. Well, I had a listener of this program reach out to me shortly after that show, and he said, I don't exactly disagree with Zeitelman's analysis, but I do think the question of why nations are poor or not is larger than are they capitalist or authoritarian, and that where they are in terms of historical context is a defining feature. And this listener specifically recommended Daron Acemoglu and his book, Why Nations Fail, as a kind of rejoinder or concurring opinion or alternate thesis as to why nations are poor or wealthy. And I was happy to do a follow-up episode. The political orphanage that you are listening to does not exist to confirm your priors. While I have my own positions and my own mental models and they feature prominently on the show, the program itself does not exist as a conveyor belt for confirmation bias. And so I am always happy to bring on different ways of looking at things, even if they are tangential or potentially contravened to how I think the world works. And I hope to bring on more challenging guests over the next few months who make me squeamish. Although today's guest didn't make me squeamish. He's a great guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. It is a fun chat. It is a thinky episode. And you might very well walk away with a whole new worldview. Enjoy! But first, the Political Orphanage is funded by its very own listeners, and you can join them by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Every week, patrons get a bonus episode, and this week's bonus episode is very fun. Jason Voyevich rejoins for a conversation about politicians and magic. We talk about the reality-bending fields that politicians are able to emanate. We talk about how politicians that are playing a different game, that see the actual three-dimensional landscape, are understanding and modifying the rules. And so those of us that lack that skill just go, oh, they're very charismatic, but it's actually something a lot more than that. I bring up some of my all-time favorite politician magic trick stories, and we even discuss the sort of counter-sorcery you can invoke to break the trance that political wizards are so good at inflicting upon us when they get us in their hypnotic gaze. So the fun continues over on the patron side of the show this week with a conversation about politics and magic. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. My guest today is Daron Acemoglu. He is an MIT Institute professor of economics, and by some counts, he is the most cited economics professor presently alive. He's the author of multiple books, but today we will specifically be discussing Why Nations Fail, which you can find at mightyheaton.com/featured, along with all of the books discussed on this program. Hello, Professor.
Hi. Very nice to be on the program.
Well, delighted to have you, and a bit intimidated, but I think it'll be a very fun conversation. So let's kick it off with this. What are the various theories that we've got for why nations fail, and which ones suck?
Well, we wrote the book for understanding long-term success and failure of nations. So within that context, the focus has been on geographic, cultural, and other theories that are sort of deterministic in some sense. Yeah. That some places are advantaged, some places are disadvantaged, some cultures are good for economic growth or modernization, some cultures are bad for economic growth. And the point of writing the book was to say, look, in fact, there is much greater agency. We build our institutions that shape how we interact with each other, what type of economic relations we get into, how we organize our societies. And it is those institutions and the incentives that they create and the opportunities that they create that are important for long-term economic success or long-term economic failure. Now, there are other issues when it comes to why nations fail. For example, right now democracy is under attack in many countries, and we have to grapple with those questions. But I think the broader framework that we provided, which is sort of emphasizing institutional factors, separating economic and political institutions, and how political institutions impact economic relations because those who have power are able to shape them, and how the groups that control political power get their way in general. I think those questions are still relevant even when we are talking about more sort of complex issues of democratic failure.
Well, your book was a pleasant surprise in that I thought it was going to be an economics book, and it is, but it's also kind of a fun history book. And it seems most similar to me of books I've read to Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And
we were inspired by Guns, Germs, and Steel.
It's a great book.
Jared is an inspiring person, but we also, thought the style in which he wrote the book, how he engaged with the reader, were really brilliant. But we disagreed with some of his points and emphasis, constructively, hopefully. Mm-hmm. So we tried to emulate part of his style, while at the same time bringing more of the relevant history and developing our own ideas.
Well, let's catalog some of his ideas and some of the other competing theories, and then we'll get to your thesis. Jared Diamond, I would say, is a geographic determinist. So if I were just to reduce an incredible book by Jared Diamond, the Europe to Asia landmass is on an x-axis, which means that if you cultivate a crop in Spain, it can shoot all the way across to Tokyo, whereas North and South America are on a y-axis. If you cultivate a crop in Argentina, it's not going to make its way up to Mexico. And so that meant that the agricultural revolution happened much slower. The ability to have resultant society with specialization happened much slower. There are also more domesticated animals in the Eurasian landmass that lead to jump over for plagues, which meant that when European contact happened, the Europeans were carrying the plagues rather than the other way around. So he's kind of the preeminent geographic guy, and that geography determines the fate of your country to a great extent. Is that just like a secondary or tertiary factor in terms of how you look at that theory?
Yeah, I would say that's a secondary factor in the sense that, yes, I absolutely agree that there are some brilliant insights in Jared's account. And obviously, what are the domesticable animals, what are the crops matter to some degree. But we don't think they are the most important determinants. And let me sort of try to explain that in a number of different ways. First of all, if you want to understand why is it that the UK is so much more prosperous and has been for the last 200 years than Egypt or than Turkey, this is not going to help. They're all part of that landmass that is favored by Jared's account. In fact, the UK was quite peripheral to it. None of those domesticable animals were in the UK. Agriculture did not start there. It went there very late.
Mm-hmm.
The population density did not increase much.
Well, and if we were taking
the British Isles for quite a while,
if we were taking bets in the year 1400 on who's going to dominate the world, most people would go not England, the Arkansas of Europe.
If you took those bets in the year 500, I think not a single person would have come up with those savages in the British Isles.
Right? Yeah, those tree worshipping savages. Yeah.
So that's not going to help. In fact, the general statistical historical pattern is that none of the places where the agricultural revolution first started are among the richest places today. So that already tells you something. Second, domesticable animals, they're quite abundant in many parts of the world, in many parts of the landmass of Asia, but also they're not that scarce in the Americas either. So this is not just a constraint. It could have been a facilitating factor, but it's not like a determining factor. And if you look at the historical pattern, reversals of which countries are ahead and then fall behind is much more remarkable than persistence during certain periods, which again sheds doubt on geographic factors as fundamental determinants.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I think that Jared Diamond's book does a great job of explaining why one hemisphere might have an advantage over another hemisphere at a very, very macro level in terms of the point of contact. But you're absolutely right. Like, how is that theory useful in terms of why would England prosper versus Mesopotamia?
And look at the country that is still the world hegemon. It is in the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good point. We got the party started later. Started later. Well, I know a theory that has very little traction for you. There's a slight amount of traction. I have it only because I hate hot temperatures, but I think it's intellectually bankrupt. Which this is the old theory that look, hot countries are lazy, cold countries plan ahead. But you would definitely take umbrage with that theory, right?
I'll take issue with that one too. Yeah. And I am with you. I don't know how I would survive these global warming impacted summers without air conditioning. But that being said, humans have built amazing civilizations in very, very hot places and in some very cold places too. Humans are hugely adaptable. And I think laziness versus hard work is so much more influenced by institutions, incentives, norms than climate. I wouldn't put much stock in.
I agree. I think that one is so easy to debunk immediately. If we go back to the year 1000 AD, the Mayans and the Aztecs are arguably more impressive than most of Western Europe, and they have larger populations in their city centers. And
that's another one of those reversals I was talking about.
Where you can flip it and go, well, then how come Iceland, Greenland, or the Inuits didn't dominate the world? They're in a cold climate. Why would there not be preeminent as opposed to...
Even within Europe, Mediterranean basin was the center of gravity for about 1,000 years at least. Much hotter than the Sweden and northern Germany or the UK.
Okay, well then I'll give you a third theory, and then we can move on to yours. This is a weird way to begin an episode by having you knock down other theories, but I'll give you a third theory, then we'll get into the meat of yours. As an economist, I would have guessed, before I read your book, that you would say the problem is bad policy. That if we just had it's good economic policies, bad economic policies, free enterprise plus safety nets or whatever, and if we do that, that's going to be the determinant factor. And you go sideways from that. So what's going on?
Well, I would again say policy matters greatly. So we are not denying that. If you want to understand why Argentina has runaway inflation, why Germany between the two wars had mega hyperinflation, you look at monetary policy. If you want to understand why Europe had such a youth unemployment problem, you need to look at policy. But what we question is that it's simply some people know what good policies are and they implement them, and some people don't know and they are some sort of trapped in some ignorance bubble and they don't know what good policies are, and that's why they're not able to do it. And all you need to do is get good advisors and you'll be fine. That's what we are questioning. Policies matter, but policies are determined within an institutional context. And that institution, by shaping incentives for policy as well as incentives for private behavior and political action, is having the dominant determinant effect.
Yeah, and I think you and your co-author are if not the pioneers, the preeminent minds of the institutionalist theory of economics. So when we get into history, there's Marxist history where we're looking at class warfare. There's various schools of history or foreign policy. There's realist and stuff. I would describe you very much as an institutionalist.
Absolutely, we are, and we're building on the shoulders of giants. There were several waves of institutional economists. A first wave that goes back to many people in the first half of the 20th century, including perhaps most famously Veblen, and then people like Williamson North and others that are more like the neo-institutionalists, and that we're building on all of those. We're bringing some of the power issues, and in fact, in that, we are also connecting with schools of thought such as Marxist ones or others on the 19th century that emphasized conflict and how conflict is resolved, but we're departing from them in emphasizing not class warfare and modes of production, but more the incentives that different types of institutions create, as well as coalitions that form that are not just along class lines, but others. If you want to understand African societies, class will not get you anywhere. Most of the coalitions are either ethnic or actually they are ad hoc that, different groups form in order to have their way, sometimes kleptocratically.
Okay, so noting that you were an institutionalist, that is the prism, it's the book is clear. The thesis, I think, is clear and concise. That there are extractive institutions and there are inclusive institutions, and that this is kind of the field or the string theory that you can look at all of history with, which I like. Once we get that bit, we can use it as a lens to look at everything. So what are inclusive and extractive institutions? Because they're fundamental to the rest of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So let me start from extractive institutions. And in some sense, we are sort of simplifying things in a 2x2 structure. We're saying there are economic institutions, political institutions, and there are extractive economic versus inclusive economic institutions, inclusive political versus inclusive extractive political institutions. And the extractive ones are, in some sense, more fun because that's where a lot of the variety is, and that's where a lot of the countries around the world are, if you look at history. Those are institutions where, say, economically, the playing field is tilted in favor of some people. They reap the benefits at the expense of others. So if you want to understand South Africa before the fall of apartheid, you need to start from how the economy was organized. In the economy, Black South Africans are the majority by far, but they control 5% of the land. They're not allowed to, by law, they're not allowed to enter into many of the occupations that we would associate with middle class or high income. they couldn't even become bricklayers or metal workers because those are skilled occupations reserved for whites. They don't get good education. They cannot organize to ask for higher wages. They are not allowed to get credit or open new businesses. So you can see the whole economy is designed in a way that is going to create a variety of disadvantages for them. Why? It's not a mistake. It's not that the Afrikaner elite that designed the economy this way, going back to the beginning of the Union of South Africa, didn't understand economics and they chose the wrong rules. That's where the policy, it's not like, oh, they adopted the right policy or not. They understood it very well that in order to keep their privileged position, they needed to sit atop of the economic hierarchy. And to do that, they wanted to keep the Black South Africans down. And that had a lot of advantages for them. They would control the best land. They would also be able to hire cheap Black labor for mines, for factories, for field work. And therefore, they didn't want to educate these people or provide opportunities for them. And in fact, they also recognized that the more educated the Black South Africans become, the more rights they will demand. So they had an additional reason for reducing the educational opportunities for Black South Africans. So that's an archetypal extractive economy where the playing field is tilted in favor of one group that has more secure assets, more command over the assets, that has greater opportunities, and the other group is purposefully disadvantaged. It doesn't have secure property rights, it doesn't have opportunities, it doesn't have the means of economic advancement. But South Africa is also interesting for showing the role of extractive political institutions. Imagine that the South African elite wanted to set up that system, but South Africa from the beginning had one person, one vote. They would have no chance in hell. No amount of propaganda.
You'd have to have a really good salesman
exactly.
to convince the Black people. You guys should vote yourself out of jobs. Trust me, it's good.
Let's have you pass legislation that does not allow you to get into any other job than the most unskilled one. Yeah, So that's not going to work very well. Might work for 1 year or 2 years, but as Abraham Lincoln said, you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. So really, the extractive economic institutions were dependent and founded upon extractive political institutions, meaning political institutions that also concentrated political power in the hands of a narrow group and removed any barriers to the exercise of that power. So in the United States, for example, or in the UK, when the political system is functional, even when a small group gets the vote and gets into government, it's not going to be able to do that because there are other checks and balances, there are other constraints on the exercise of that power. But the Constitution of the Union of South Africa actually enshrined the ability of the white minority to do that. So the whole system is designed to increase the political control of that group. So that's extractive political institutions, supporting extractive economic institutions. And of course, there's a synergy the other way as well. The richer you are, the more control over economic resources you have. That's going to make it easier for you to also control politics. Now, what are inclusive institutions? Think of them as the opposite, meaning creating a more inclusive environment where the playing field is not so tilted, opportunities are open to everybody, the property rights of everybody is secure. So it's not like, you're right, you're white, your factory is secure, I'm Black, my factory is not secure. No, the property rights are broadly recognized and opportunities are broadly available. But then we also make the same point. Those sorts of inclusive economic institutions are not going to be that easy to implement and maintain if political power is skewed. So if your family controls all political power, but then I have a lot of rights and a lot of goodies, that's not going to be very stable because at some point, one of your family is going to be tempted to take those things away or tilt the playing field a little bit to your favor.
So when we talk about extractive institutions, I would say basically feudalism was an extractive institution where
Absolutely.
You have, maybe 1% of the population that can live very wealthy by just squeezing blood out of a turnip of the majority of the population. Like it's not good for growth. You're not encouraging anybody to make additional money. You're just sucking a little bit of labor that you can barely get out of a bunch of really impoverished people. But that's enough for you to live very well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can see that because when economic conditions, technology, and productivity improved in the medieval economy, surprise, surprise, what happened? The conditions of the working people, the peasants, did not improve that much. But aristocrats and the clergy, the top clergy, became even wealthier. That's when they started building those huge cathedrals.
So I'm going to jump ahead and ask a dumb question here. You are a feudal lord or some kind of white baron in South Africa before the reforms, and I come to you and go, hey, if you will make an inclusive institution where people have a little bit more purchase, they have property rights, they have a little bit more freedom of mobility, innovation, things like that, your country is going to get so much wealthier that you yourself, as the elite, will be much wealthier. That seems like a no-brainer to me, even if you're a bad person. So how come that doesn't naturally happen?
Yeah, or even better, you can go in history books as the person who reformed and created a wonderful system.
Yeah.
But the problem is, this is what we call the commitment problem.
I have a lot of that. Go on.
That power, that control, what guarantee do you have that those, downtrodden masses who you exploited until now are going to say, okay, yeah, you were so nice to us, and we're going to keep on giving you 25% of the income and give you all of this prestige because you are the ones who liberated us? Or they can turn around and say, no thanks. We're going to kick you out and take your land and perhaps even put you in jail for not doing this for the last 25 years. So often, especially taking into account that any fundamental reform is going to create tumultuous times, the option of, let me be the elite and reform the system and still benefit from it, that's not very easy. A few people have been able to pull that off. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. But generally it's not that such an easy option. And therefore you see that the people who are reformers, modernizers, are often pretty iron-fisted, like Ataturk in Turkey.
So I'm going to make sure that I understand the foundational concept before we go further here. We're talking the prism with which to look at poverty in nations is, are they inclusive or extractive institutions? So throwing out a hypothetical example here, we're living in a feudal society. I am a feudal landowner and I rent my land to you, the serf. We can scale this up and go, well, you as the serf have no reason to improve the land because you know that you don't own it. And I am just extracting what little labor I can. And so we're kind of locked in this negative feedback loop. But that's an extractive institution. But an inclusive institution would be where I don't know, I sell you the land, or you have the option to buy the land, or we redistribute the land from the feudal lords. But there's something where your effort as a normal person can be rewarded, and thus you are encouraged to do innovation.
And that's why, like, for example, in agriculture, a lot more inclusive institutions come about when there are widespread property rights. So when I can own my own land so that I can sell it, I know that I can get the rewards if I improve the land, or I buy new equipment, or crop something, or choose some new crops, that I'm going to benefit from that. So if you look at the miracle of Chinese economic growth, it started in the rural sector, where peasants did not have any incentive to choose investments because all of their output was taken at predetermined low prices. But once there was a little bit of incentives for first township and village enterprises, and then for households themselves in the household responsibility system to keep some of the gains, they started improving the land, investing, choosing better crops, and increasing production. So that's the little bit of inclusivity taking a long way.
Adam Smith kind of presages this when he talks about slavery. And he goes, look, slavery, morality aside, which he had a lot to say on, slavery is an inherently unproductive system because the person's only going to work enough not to be beaten. That's it. Their only motivation is avoid getting beaten. So why on earth would they do anything beyond that? Whereas if you have a situation where, hey, if you produce more value, you get to keep more of the money. If you sell more widgets or you work more hours, you get more stuff. And people are more apt to do that, and it has a catalytic effect that gets the economy going.
100%.
Great. So can you then order the following for me in terms of importance? Which is most important, which is least important? Property rights, political stability, and democratic input.
Oh boy.
They're all good. But in terms of getting a country's economy up and running, what would you put first?
Well, look, I think basic property rights are key. But it also matters who has property rights and how unequal they are. So if we suddenly start the economy in a situation where you control 99% of all land in the United States and the remaining 300 million people control 1%, and we say, now we're going to introduce secure property rights, your 99% is secure, that's still going to create a distorted system. So some basic openness of the system for opportunity on top of that secure property rights for people, I think, is very, very important. Stability, I think, matters via the same sort of mechanisms as property rights. Because if I tell you, oh, your land is secure, your property rights, nobody's going to take your land away. But we are in such an unstable environment in which tax rates could go up to 100% or could drop to 0%. Prices can fluctuate wildly. Well, that also creates a de facto insecure property rights because you don't know whether what you produce is going to fetch any money or not. So stability is tapping into the same problems as insecure property rights. And more broadly than property rights, because it's going to affect innovation, it's going to affect schooling, it's going to affect all sorts of things that are major inputs. And then democracy is a very important part of what we are calling inclusive political institutions. Democratic input is one of those things that's going to make sure that tomorrow we suddenly don't violate the property rights or don't introduce crazy instabilities and so on.
As you point out, it would be difficult to completely separate and silo these various rights. If you went, hey, we're only going to let 20 guys in the country vote, but everybody gets to keep total property rights. We promise never to take, at some point, people, they're going to take your stuff. So, okay, so there might be
and again, this is not hypothetical. In the book, we also discuss the history of Barbados, where, about 200 families owned all the land. They owned all the slaves. They controlled the government. They controlled the bureaucracy. They themselves had very secure property rights. In fact, they had property rights over other humans as well. But that's not the kind of property rights we're talking about.
Right. Okay. So normally when I'm having conversations about economics, or more specifically when I'm having fights about economics, the dichotomy that I tend to use is some variant of a command economy versus free enterprise. And I want a little bit of regulation. I want law to exist, but generally, I'm on the free enterprise side of the thing. It sounds to me like there's overlap between a free enterprise versus command economy, but it doesn't sound like a one-to-one synonym.
I don't think it does. And this is, again, freedom starting from where and freedom to do what. So you can start from a situation where you own 99% of the land and control everything. And we say, okay, now we're giving everybody freedom. Okay. The remaining 99% is free to either starve to death or come and work for you for low wages. That's not going to be a great environment.
Right.
Free enterprise, also we have seen, I think, over the last several decades, especially in the information age, has a great tendency to create gigantic monopolies, as with, the tech companies that we are witnessing right now. So I think free enterprise by itself is not enough. So that's why in the book, we coined the term inclusive markets, not free markets, not command, but inclusive markets. And inclusive markets are markets embedded in inclusive institutions with the right amount of regulation and the right enabling acts from the government, like education. Private education could work under some circumstances. In most circumstances, it doesn't. It's not equitable enough. It's not high quality enough for the majority of the population. And if you want to have equal opportunity in the modern world, you need pretty decent education for everybody. So in a country like Chile, which has been democratic for 30 plus years and has many things going for it, inequality is still very high, and the population much of the population still feels the institutional arrangements are not fair because there are a few high-quality educational institutions that supply all of the upper echelons of people in the C-suite and the politicians and the bankers, and only the very rich have access to these very good institutions. So concentration of educational opportunities can also undermine the functioning of the market. So that's why free market's a little bit too indeterminate, too incoherent.
Okay.
For James Robinson's taste, so that's why we talk of inclusive markets.
This is coming together for me. So like the free market versus command economy might be an important policy decision that we're making, but that's in terms of the predictor of who's going to be wealthy or not as a country, that's still going to be secondary to the institutions. So like if you have
and if you look at it this way, you also realize something else. And I don't want to overstate the case, but there is some commonality between the Soviet Union, a rigid command economy, and Egypt under Mubarak, which was a market economy. And the commonality is that in both cases, whoever controls political power is able to leverage that to structure economic relations in such a way as to favor themselves, their own status, their own enrichment, their own consumption, and their family's well-being at the expense of the rest. In Mubarak's case, that's by corruption and creating monopolies and bringing his family to prominent places. In the Soviet Russia, it's through the party's control and who gets the spoils through that process.
Okay. And I like your point that there's a greater historical context that all of this is taking place in. So if you're England and you've had a feudal background where 3% of the population owns 90% of the land, and then I don't know, Margaret Thatcher comes in this bizarre alternate universe and goes, "We're not having serfs anymore. Serfs are gone. You can do whatever you want. You're free. You're free." That just adding like you no longer have coercive elements from the government or for your feudal lords isn't going to assuage all of these issues because you have all this institutional baggage that has put all of the economic clout on one particular side through those extractive institutions.
Or let me give you another example, which I think is telling. The naivest sort of free market perspective, Adam Smith Goes to Moscow, was, okay, we're going to take the Soviet economy and we're going to create free markets by taking all of these huge enterprises and privatizing. We're going to give one share of or 10 shares of each one of these companies to each Russian citizen. Well, that turned out to be a disaster. Why? Well, because that was done in a particular institutional setup in which some people already controlled these corporations. There was money pouring in. The population was uneducated, very poor. So immediately people collected those shares and they also cornered the most profitable companies and they became the richest oligarchs the world had seen at the time. And nothing of the sort of the market economy's efficiency or fairness actually got realized.
Let's talk about the USSR for a minute. I like your root thesis. Look, it's about extractive and inclusive institutions. I am a Russian peasant. I'm clearly living under a extractive institution because I'm effectively a land-bound slave as a serf in Russia. And Lenin comes by and he's like, we're going to build the most inclusive institution in all of human history. This is going to be so, you're going to be amazed at how inclusive this is. It's going to be a dictator of the proletariat, which is you. How do you distinguish between inclusive institutions that are really inclusive versus extractive institutions that are parading as inclusive institutions?
Well, there is a gray area, and that's why propaganda and misleading things can happen. But just for the record, the Russian peasants, however low education they didn't fall for that.
Okay.
They did not support the Bolsheviks.
Uh-huh.
Actually, pretty much nobody supported the Bolsheviks. It was all sort of Lenin's a great timing for grabbing power and his rhetorical powers. Bolsheviks means the majority, but that was a complete lie. His group was the minority, and he called the majority, the Mensheviks, the minority, and he called himself the Bolsheviks. And somehow that stuck. I don't know why. There were other people who were supporting the Social Democrats, the sort of the communist or communist-inspired groups, but even the Social Democrats overall had very low support. So people didn't actually fall for Lenin. He just grabbed power and via military means consolidated it to a large extent. And then, after 70 years, there were people who, were credulous enough to believe in the Soviet myth, but not that many of them. And that's why every time the Soviet or communist control weakened in Poland, in Hungary, in Eastern Germany, people rushed out and people toppled dictators. So people can be gullible, but they're not that gullible. But this is the problem, and this is what we call the iron law of oligarchy after Robert Michaels, a German sociologist, which is, if you are going to topple one sort of oligarchy, the most likely outcome is that the group that was at the forefront of that toppling becomes the oligarchy itself. So that is a pattern you see, unfortunately, all too often in history, and our sort of solution to that. The solution is not quite the right word. Is it's broad coalitions are very important. If you had a group of people who come from different walks of life, representing different viewpoints, different economic interests, different historical backgrounds, one very narrow group becoming the oligarchs or the dictators becomes less likely, and it becomes more conducive to building institutions that are going to protect each different group within that broad coalition. And that's our interpretation of how more democratic governance forms emerged in Europe, because when reform happened, especially in England, it was much more through these broad coalitions than just the Bolsheviks being the head of the spear.
So when the fall of the Soviet Union happened in Poland, it was a combination of the Catholic Church and the trade unions that were opposing the Soviet structure. So
that's right.
Multiple
That was
groups
a great combination, because the trade unions more from the workers, the Catholic Church more sort of traditionalist but with mass appeal. That worked very well. And, there were other things that helped the Polish case, but no wonder Poland has been a real success story, both in terms of democratization and in terms of economic growth.
So throughout your book, you paint a picture where extractive institutions sow the seeds of their own destruction, that they're not innovative because the people running them fear changes to the status quo, and they also just are poor because they're not able to catalyze growth, and then they're prone to infighting because whoever's on the top, you want to shove them off and get it. Are you still generally of the opinion that they are inherently unstable with social media and surveillance technology? Do you think that as we advance technologically, that will further entrench extractive institutions, or do you think it'll make them even more deleterious or precarious?
Let me first clarify our thesis, but I'm definitely blaming ourselves for not being clear on this, because we actually wrote a second book several years after that called The Narrow Corridor, which did several things, including clarifying this aspect. We didn't mean to support or argue for a sort of end of history perspective that everything leads to liberal democracy and modernization is inevitable, and extractive regimes are going to fall, inclusive regimes are going to triumph.
Okay.
Far from it. In fact, our point is that both systems can be stable, but extractive institutions are going to have more inherent tensions, which is going to make it difficult for them to have sustained growth. And those tensions under certain circumstances are also going to lead to infighting, but that infighting is most likely going to lead to another extractive regime. But also inclusive, and we try to emphasize that, for example, in chapter 10 of chapters 10 and 11 of Why Nations Fail, inclusive institutions are always going to be under attack as well. So you're going to have monopolies form, authoritarian leaders trying to grab power, everybody trying to form their own sphere of influence so that they can tilt things a little bit to their advantage. So there isn't any sort of end of history element to our thinking. But It is also true what you said, which is that surveillance technologies, of course, increase the durability of any given regime because they can really put down dissent. And we're seeing that in China.
Okay. Well, speaking of China, or the Soviet Union for that matter, both under Mao and under Stalin, these two communist regimes were highly extractive economies where, peasants, were shot if they didn't do a sufficient amount of agriculture, or some other horrible, horrible system in place led to starvation, so on and so forth. There's still periods of economic boom in the early Soviet Union and post-Mao. Is that propaganda that the West bought? Is it
no?
They
no. There's both of them. There are elements of both. So there's something we call extractive growth.
Okay.
And extractive growth is what the term we use for describing how especially extractive regimes can grow by channeling resources to large companies, supporting certain sectors, borrowing technologies from abroad. And that can go on for quite a while. In the Roman Empire, that went on for 300-400 years before the empire completely crumbled. The Soviet Union looked like a viable alternative. Some of that was delusional, but some of that was real. But if you look at, for example, North Korea, today North Korea is building nuclear weapons and rocket systems to actually launch those weapons quite far. Is that because North Korea is very innovative? No, far from it.
Yeah.
They have stolen the technology via Pakistan, and then they have poured in a lot of money to build rockets according to designs that exist and enrich uranium, which again is a known technology but requires a lot of resources. And if you single-mindedly put all of your resources into building nuclear weapons, you can do that. Soviet Union and North Korea proved that. But they're not going to be truly innovative to reach the types of levels of prosperity that you see in Germany or the US or much of the industrialized world. But there's also, naivete. Was it a little bit of rhetoric on the part of the Defense Department and the CIA that they wanted to increase armaments and that's why they exaggerated Soviet prowess? I don't know. But many policymakers and much of the public in the 60s, 70s, 80s believed that the Soviet Union was ahead of the US, especially after Sputnik.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of extractive growth, if I'm reading you right, is it kind of like in the Soviet Union, or I assume pre-Maoist China, you have these old extractive institutions. You have serfdom or the lingering ramifications of serfdom, where there's an extractive agrarian economy that's not productive. And then you have a new regime come in and it sets up a different kind of extractive economy. Yeah. And as long as it shifts those resources to something that's more productive, there's at least gains going from old.
Absolutely.
So it's,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so
it's like a one-time transfer.
Some of it is using existing methods. Some of it is creating new methods. So when did the Soviet economy grow most rapidly? I think, I may be mistaken here because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was actually during the forced industrialization under Stalin, where collectivization of agriculture is taking place. Millions of people are dying in Ukraine. Nothing that looks like economic efficiency, but it enabled Stalin to take those grain and resources from the countryside, and especially Ukraine, and pour them into heavy armaments and heavy industry that did generate some growth for the Soviet Union.
Okay. Well, I'll shift in terms to application now. if you were called in as a consultant to a country, let's say somewhere in Africa that is very low performing in terms of economic growth, what are the metrics that you would want to look for, or just they're going to use your recipe to fix the country? What are you going to be looking for to analyze and fix?
Well, first of all, who is calling you for as a consultant?
In this instance, the ruling junta loved your book.
Exactly.
The ruling junta loved your book.
The ruling junta is part of the problem, so I wouldn't want to work for them.
Okay.
But, on the whole, under any political system, creating more inclusivity in the economic institutions in a stable manner, in a manner that's not going to create backlash, and in a manner that does not unfairly privilege narrow groups, I think is conducive to better economic allocations. But the devil's in the detail, because how do you know that? For instance, in Mexico, under the rule of the Institutionalist Revolutionary Party, the economy was a very inefficient mess of regulations and control. So then some economists and policymakers said, we need to liberalize this economy. So that sounds like a great idea. Yes, you should liberalize that economy. And then what do? They went and privatized the most valuable assets like telecommunication and petrol, and they gave them to a single company. Carlos Slim now became the richest person in the world. So is that a more inclusive, better arrangement than the PRI's control? Well, debatable. So the devil's in the details. So in the name of liberalizing the system or creating more competition, you can actually create more monopolies.
Okay. And monopolies are going to be extractive institutions.
They're not great. No.
Yeah. They're not going to be good, because the monopolies presumably are going to be opposed to innovators coming in and disrupting the system.
They're going to be opposed to innovators coming in. They're going to charge high prices. They're going to create inequality. They're going to create inefficiency, all sorts of things.
So looking at the United States, if you wanted to make an inclusive market, or you wanted to make it a more inclusive market, what are the things that you would want to tinker with policy-wise that could change things for more upward mobility, more innovation, more disruptors coming into entrenched fields?
Well, I think we could start from many places, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but look at the United States. The level of social mobility in this country is very low. So compare U.S. social mobility, the likelihood that somebody born in poverty rises to upper middle class is much lower in the United States than Germany, Sweden, Canada, so on. And why is that? Well, it's actually not that easy to get good education in the United States. Poor people, inner cities, and other parts of the economy or the country that are not well off don't get very good education. Schools are failing. There are lots of social problems that also hold back people in those areas, crime, and a variety of other social issues. And it's not that easy to become like a very fast-growing business. Opening new businesses is not that easy, and you're faced with lots of monopolies that often have government support. So all of these things are elements that reduce social mobility in the United States, despite the fact that this is an open country. This is a new country. It's a country of immigrants and newcomers. So you would expect greater social mobility. And the view that Americans for a long time had of their country was that this was a country of opportunity. But data show otherwise. So I think fixing that, and for fixing that, we need better education, better healthcare system, better regulation of markets.
Okay. And so in terms of, I read an article recently where there was an economic group out of Paris that I think was associated with Piketty. I don't think it was a free market outfit at all. But their read on the problems in the United States was that our tax regime was actually very progressive, potentially more progressive than Europe, but the failure was more on the application of government services like education. That the issue that was colliding was that people were getting entrenched in their various other aspects, kind of outside of tax rates.
I think the tax issue is very complicated. So there are parts of the U.S. tax system that are very progressive. After all, in the United States, about half of the population pays no or very little income taxes.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you look at taxes on the very, very rich, they're extremely low. So it's a very strange system. Taxes are concentrated on the middle class.
Yeah.
And that creates a lot of problems because the middle class is part of what should be more upwardly mobile and should challenge the billionaires and so on. So I also think the way that we tax capital and labor is very weird. So today, if you're a business and if you hire 100 workers to do some job, jointly you and the workers will pay something upwards of 30% in taxes. Payroll taxes, income taxes, health contributions, and so on. If instead you hire a machine to do the same job for the same amount, you pay less than 5% tax. So there are weird things in our tax system that I think should be redressed.
If people start responding to incentives from the tax system, that could really spell out some trouble there, Doctor.
That's right, exactly.
Are there any global institutions that you think are good at promoting inclusive institutions?
That's a very, very interesting topic, and it's one of the issues we didn't address in Why Nations Fail because the book is already long, and that would have required another 100 or so pages. But we live in an increasingly globalized world where many of the problems that we're grappling with don't have national boundaries. Multinational companies, pandemics, technology, AI, climate change, peace, all of nuclear weapons, all of those are global problems. We need national institutions to deal with national problems. We need national institutions to represent nations in the global sphere. But to deal with truly global challenges, we need global governance. So we need global institutions. Unfortunately, it's much harder to build global institutions, and we don't have any good ones. Well, WHO, proved not up to the task during the pandemic because it doesn't have independence. UN doesn't have much muscle. The IMF is very much viewed, and probably rightly so, as an agent of the United States, meaning that it represents the interests of United States capital and has values that are aligned with the United States. So China and Russia see, and the countries allied with China and Russia see IMF as, doing the US's bidding. So, but I don't see what the solution is. It's going to be very difficult to have a global institution that has enforcement power over China and the United States.
Yeah.
These countries don't even accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice because they don't want any enforcement power over them. But we do need some global institutions.
Well, I share your general skepticism on the efficacy of large multinational institutions being able to push other ones around. That does seem to be something that they don't have. But
then again, we have multinational large corporations that are pushing people around.
And I would say that the International Atomic Energy Agency has actually been very successful as an international enterprise.
Absolutely. And we are thankful to that agency. Without them, we wouldn't have any clue about what's going on with nuclear.
I would say there'd just be a lot more nuclear powers, I think what would have happened if it had been. So a couple more questions.
But I think it's not, look, Google exists in every country and has power over the consumers of every country. So you have that multinational organizations already. So you do need some sort of counterbalance to them.
A couple more questions for you, then I'll let you go. In terms of, you talked a little bit about the lack of class fluidity in the United States or upward mobility in the United States. What is something America does that Europe would be good to emulate? And what is something that the Europeans do that America would be good to emulate?
I think US is much more innovative. Today, the US economy is doing better than most European ones, and part of that is because of innovation. Especially in Silicon Valley, there is a great amount of energy, entrepreneurial spirit, risk-taking. But on the other hand, Silicon Valley is also an emblem of the things that are not working so well in the United States. Silicon Valley has created the biggest monopolies. All of that innovation gets concentrated and bought up by Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, that have been able to build an even bigger empire by buying all of their competitors. So we're not regulating things very well. In fact, in the field of AI, where I'm doing a lot of research on, the sort of the caricature that people have in mind, which is not incorrect, is US innovates, Europe regulates, and we need both of them. But we need both of them to be done in the same country. Europe needs to be more of an innovation hub in that area as well, and the US needs to do its own regulation, including antitrust.
Well, then, I guess final question then, is the innovation occurring in the United States and lack thereof in Europe because of institutions that are extractive and inclusive, or is it some other phenomenon?
I think there is a important element of institutions. US encourages risk-taking and rewards success more than Europe, and also enables companies to grow via venture capital. For example, if you start a business and fail in Europe, you're not going to be able to get a second chance. If you look at Silicon Valley successful companies, they have a string of failures before the success came. Mm-hmm. So that's institutional, but also the lack of antitrust, the lack of regulation, the lack of redistribution is institutional.
Okay. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I will add, on top of a fascinating book, once again, my guest today has been Dr. Daron Acemoglu, and the book we've been discussing is Why Nations Fail. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. This was my pleasure to be on the program. Thanks for having me.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Professor Daron Acemoglu, for coming on to discuss the institutional theory of wealth. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. And thank you, patrons who make the show possible. I don't care what anybody says. Y'all are an inclusive institution in my book. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.